Hey 8th graders, I'm Ms. Henderson. I'm an 8th grade ELA teacher at Ferndale Middle School, but I'm really excited to be working with you today. For this lesson, you'll need your ELA notebook, pen, pencil, something to write with, and your Research Question 1 organizer. And if you have our core text, George versus George, you can have that as well, but if not, don't worry about it. Today we're going to use our knowledge of chronological and sequential order text structure to create a timeline of events leading up to and resulting from the American Revolution. So how do we do this? First, we have to understand why authors use chronological and sequential order text structure, and we have to understand how texts are organized using that text structure. Then we're going to use that knowledge to help us identify key events in our text. And then finally, we're going to determine the central idea of those events and then put them into our timeline. So what is text structure? What do I mean by that? Text structure is the way that an author arranges information in their writing. So we're going to look at chronological and sequential order text structure. And this is usually when we see events or steps in a process that are presented in an order. And the signal words for this text structure are dates, years. We might see words like first, next, before, and after. And these all signal to us that the author is using chronological order text structure. So the author might use timelines when they're using this text structure. They might use lists. And so these are all the things we're going to look out for while we're reading. Authors may use chronological order, particularly in historical text, because these texts often describe a particular series of events in history. So we're going to, again, create a timeline that will illustrate the events that lead up to, occurred during, and after our American Revolution event. So as we read today, we're going to look out for signal words and phrases, and these will help us identify the important events we need in our timeline. So I'm going to model how to begin a timeline of events during the American Revolution. I'm only going to start out with 3 events, but your teacher's likely going to have you do more. So while we're reading, we're going to look out for our signal words. Do we see dates, years, words like first, next, before, after, then this happened? We're going to look out for that while we're reading. So now we're going to look for some events that led up to the American Revolution, events that I can add into my timeline, and we're going to do that by looking for those signal words. So while I'm reading, if you have this book, George versus George, you can turn to page 23 and follow along, and if you don't have it, that's totally fine. You can just follow along on the screen. It just so happened that on the very same day as the violence in Boston, Parliament and King George over in London were trying to keep the peace. So this happens right after the Boston Massacre. They got rid of all import taxes except for one tiny tax on British tea. They thought that would solve the problem, but it didn't. Lots of colonists resented paying any British taxes, no matter how tiny. It was a matter of principle. Some refused to drink British tea and drank tea smuggled from Holland instead. Others, including George Washington, stopped drinking tea altogether. By 1773, the British East India Company had so much unsold tea sitting around that it was about to go broke. To keep this tea company in business, Great Britain's Prime Minister, Lord North, proclaimed that absolutely nobody except the East India Company could sell any tea in America. To convince colonists to buy the tea, prices were set so low that even with tea taxes, the company's tea cost less than any other tea sold in England or in America. The colonists loved tea, but most of them still thought this was taxation without representation. British tea either rotted in warehouses or got sent straight back to England. Before long, Royal Governor of Massachusetts, Thomas Hutchinson, declared that unless the tax was paid, none of the tea shipped to Boston Harbor could be sent away. If the tea was not unloaded, ship commanders would force it on shore under the cover of their cannons' mouths. On the night of December 16, 1773, some Sons of Liberty covered their faces and hands with coal dust, disguised themselves as Mohawk Indians, and very calmly filed on board 3 ships filled with tea. Hundreds gathered to watch as the men split open 342 chests of British Darjeeling tea with tomahawks and fed all 45 tons of it to the fish. Most Britons were outraged when they heard news of the wanton destruction. Americans were clearly a race of convicts. They had gone too far and must be punished. 6 months later, the king, in an angry parliament, closed Boston Harbor. Nothing could come in and nothing could go out. Now, did you notice any signal words? A bunch of them stood out to me, so let's see if we can find them. The first one that stood out to me was by 1773. That's a date, right? We also have on December 16th, 1773, and then 6 months later. So these words indicate that something's happening during this time. Next, we're going to determine the central idea of this text. What mainly happened in this event? We've been working with central idea a lot, so this is just a little bit of extra practice. And we know the first thing we want to do is pull out some key details that are going to help us support our central idea. So I'm going to point out this first key detail, that colonists loved tea, but most of them still thought that this was taxation without representation. So they weren't going to buy the tea regardless. The next detail I want to point out is what happened on December 16, 1773. This was the Boston Tea Party, where they took all the tea and dumped it in the ocean to protest the tea tax. And then finally, at the end, we learn that the king, in response to the Boston Tea Party, decides to close the harbor, so nothing can come in and so nothing can go out. So we get to a central idea that the colonists refused to pay any British tax, including the one on tea. Colonists threw British tea in the Boston Harbor during the Boston Tea Party, prompting Parliament to close the harbor. So what we're going to do is we're going to add that to our timeline, 1773, and we're just going to insert our central idea, and we're going to add our citation so we know where that happened and what book we found that information in. Now let's look for 2 more events that we can add to our timeline. So we're going to be reading from page 36 in the book. If you don't have it, that's totally fine. You can follow along on the screen. But while I'm reading, I want you to see if you notice any signal words like dates, words like before, then, next, stuff like that. A New Nation, 1776. While Washington's soldiers and King George's soldiers were fighting one another, the Continental Congress made a crucial decision. Instead of just battling for their rights as citizens of Great Britain, they decided to aim for total American independence. To rally Americans to their cause and get support from Europe, they set to work writing a document that claimed the right of all people to choose their own government. It also placed the blame for every single one of their grievances squarely on the shoulders of King George himself. This document was the Declaration of Independence, and its signers had just given birth to the United States of America. Did you notice a signal word while I was reading? The one that really should have stood out to you was the date, 1776. And while Washington's soldiers and King George's soldiers were fighting one another. So this tells us that this was all happening while the colonists and Great Britain were fighting. Now we're going to determine the central idea of what happened in this event. So I'm going to pull out my details, and mainly this top portion or first paragraph of this text helps us understand what really went on. This section of the text helps us understand that Continental Congress got together to write the Declaration of the United States and declare our independence. So our central idea should look something like this. While the British and colonists were fighting, the Continental Congress wrote the Declaration of Independence, and we're going to go ahead and add that to our timeline. We're going to add the date, 1776, and we're going to add our central idea with our citation. Let's look for our last event now. We're going to look in page 52 to 53. Again, if you don't have the book, it's totally fine. Just follow along. But what we really want to look out for are our signal words. No kings for America. King George tried hard to continue the struggle, but British support faded fast. The king was so humiliated that he almost gave up his crown. It took several years for his attitude to change. George Washington was encouraged by an officer in his army to become the King of America. He was horrified. It took 2 years of meetings to plan for peace. In Paris, France, on September 3, 1783, England finally signed a peace treaty with France and Spain that also included total independence and a vast amount of land for America. At long last, it was official. King George and Great Britain had lost the 13 colonies forever, and the United States of America had been born. So while I was reading, did you notice any signal words? You should have pointed out 2 years, so it took 2 years of meeting to plan for peace, and then this date, September 3rd, 1783. So now that we've pulled out our signal words, let's determine the central idea of this event. So in this event, England signed a peace treaty with France and Spain that also included independence for the 13 colonies. So we're going to add that event to our timeline. We're going to add our date, 1783, and then we're going to add our central idea with our citation. And our timeline looks good. So I could add a ton of events during the American Revolution, but just these 3 events do help me understand what led up to the American Revolution, an event that occurred during, and then what eventually led to the end of the American Revolution. So you guys are going to do the same thing with your event. You're going to look for what are some events that led up to my American Revolution event? What are some things that happened during, and how did it end? And your teacher, again, will probably have you do more than just 3 events, but you at least know how to get started. So let's review what we did today. First, we reviewed chronological and sequential order text structure. We also identified signal words that led us to find historical events to add to our timeline. And we continued to practice determining the central idea of sections of the text in George versus George. And then finally, we learned how to organize our American Revolution timeline. So hopefully after this lesson, you're a little bit more comfortable with how to complete your first research question. Thank you for learning with me today. I can't wait to see you back here for our next lesson.